Welcome to Genos Historia, a channel dedicated to explain the cool new things that DNA, especially ancient DNA, is revealing to us about the ancestral history of human populations. This video you're watching is episode 5 of a 9-episode series on Viking ancient DNA. Here in episode 5, I'll be looking at DNA samples from Kievan, Rus, which was the earliest manifestation of the modern country of Russia. Few people know that this early form of Russia, called Kievan Rus, was in large part created by Swedish Viking settlements in Eastern Europe. This fact is expressed in this ancient DNA, as it shows that most of these DNA samples from Kievan Rus I'm going to be looking at have some Scandinavian ancestry. But before I get into that, I need to make two things clear. The first is that the DNA samples I'm looking at in this video come from the study Margarin 2020. The second is that the opinions that I express about these ancient DNA samples are not the opinions of Margarin 2020, but are my own opinions that I came to by studying the DNA myself using the G25 PCA from the Eurogenes blog. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into this episode 3 of my series. So this map shows the sites that the Kievan Rus DNA samples I'm going to be looking at come from. There's 3 sites in Russia, 2 in Ukraine, and then a handful in Poland. The ones in Poland aren't in Kievan Rus territory, but they were Kievan Rus nobility who were buried in Poland. All of these DNA samples date to about 1000 AD. This is right at the end of the Viking Age, and by this time Kievan Rus was its own state. It wasn't a Viking-controlled area, but it was still fresh with recent Viking influence. And a lot of these DNA samples, especially the ones in Russia, come from what were originally Viking settlements. So first let's look at the DNA results from the 2 sites in Russia, Ladgo and Gnazadovo. These were settlements originally created by Vikings a few centuries earlier, and the DNA shows that almost all the people in these settlements still had some Scandinavian ancestry. So there's 26 DNA samples from these 2 sites. Of them, 14 of 26, which is about half, have mixed Eastern European and Scandinavian ancestry. As for their Eastern European ancestry, I'm not just going to leave it as saying it's Eastern European, because that's too generic. I can tell that it comes from 3 different sources. And this is because this part of Eastern Europe is inhabited by 3 different ethno-linguistic groups who have different languages and different ancestral histories. And these 3 groups are Balts, Eastern Slavs, and Finns. Of these 14 Kievan Rus samples with mixed ancestry, their Eastern European side of their ancestry is Eastern Slavic for 7 of them, Finnic for 6 of them, and Baltic for 2 of them. 9 of 26 of these Kievan Rus samples in Russia don't have mixed ancestry. Of them, 6 of them were 100% Scandinavian, and I can tell specifically Swedish, and 2 of them were 100% Eastern Slavic, and 1 was 100% Baltic. There were a few outliers among these Kievan Rus DNA samples in Russia, but I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about them. I'll just say that a few of them seem to have had French and admixture from Western Europe. One seems to have been from Czechoslovakia, and the one I will talk about is that one had mixed Greek and Slavic ancestry. And this would be because Kievan Rus, early Russia, had close ties to the Byzantine Empire, which was basically Greece, and their royalty would often intermarry with each other. And so we have an example here of somebody who was a product of that intermarriage between the Byzantine Empire and early Russia. The big picture that I get from these DNA samples from these 2 sites in Kievan Rus, Russia, is that most of them obviously had Scandinavian admixture because they were originally Viking settlements, and they were mixing with various different tribes who inhabited that part of Eastern Europe. That's the takeaway. So moving on, let's look at the Kievan Rus DNA samples from Poland. So Poland was not Kievan Rus territory, but these are burials from Kievan Rus nobility who were buried in Poland. They had really rich grave goods, clearly showing that they were nobility with fancy swords, fancy ornaments, and jewels and stuff like that. So these were very important people. There's 7 DNA samples from them. So 6 of 7 of these Kievan Rus nobility have surprise mixed Eastern European and Scandinavian ancestry. But one of them was 100% Eastern Slavic, so he's kind of an outlier. For the 6 mixed individuals, their they were more Eastern European than Scandinavian. They were about 70% Eastern European on average and 30% Scandinavian. Their Eastern European ancestry seems to have been coming from around northwest Russia and Lithuania, or I should say around Belarus and Lithuania. For half of them, it seems to match modern Lithuanians, and for the other half of them, it matches modern Belarusians. So that seems to be the area of Kievan Rus that they came from, and then they were buried in Poland. Okay, moving on. The last Kievan Rus DNA to look at comes from 2 sites in Ukraine. There's only 3 DNA samples from these sites, so 2 of them have mixed Scandinavian and Finnic ancestry. So the Finnic people live in northwest Russia and Ukraine, so these 2 Kievan Rus people must have come from northern Russia and then were buried in Ukraine. The third and last sample to look at here in Ukraine is really interesting because it comes from a known historical prince of Kievan Rus named Gleb Slovadovic. So here's another example of DNA from a Kievan Rus noble. He lived in about 1000 AD, and he was originally from the city of Novograd. Unlike those Kievan Rus nobles in Poland, his DNA does not show any Viking/Scandinavian ancestry, but he was mixed. But he was mixed in a different way. He was mixed Eastern Slavic and Greek, just like that one sample from Russia I mentioned. So he's another example of the royalty in the Byzantine Empire and Russia intermarrying with each other, and he's a product of this. When I looked this guy up, Gleb Slovadovic, on Wikipedia, I didn't see any mention of a Greek person in his genealogy. So this DNA might mean that his historical genealogy is wrong, and that he might have a Greek grandmother that is not mentioned in his genealogy. That's it for this video. The last thing I'll say is that I know the question comes up after I make a video about Viking descendants in early Russia is, do modern Russians have some Scandinavian/Viking admixture? I have not looked closely into this because I always just assume that they don't. But as far as I know, Russians are very closely related to Ukrainians, Poles, Belarusians. They're basically, as far as I know, 100% Slavic or Eastern Slavic, whatever that is exactly. We don't know exactly what it is. And so there may be some people in Russia with Scandinavian admixture, but the DNA samples from Russia that I know of don't seem to have this. That's it for this video. In my next video, I'll be looking at the diversity of Viking Age Scandinavia. And yes, there was some diversity in it, at least among the Christians in Viking Age Scandinavia, many of whom seem to have been immigrants from other parts of Europe, mainly France and Germany. That video will be very interesting, so stay tuned for it.